Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and in this video, we'll be looking at SQL Server 2008 PowerShell. Now, PowerShell is not specific to SQL Server. It is a scripting language that you're going to find available throughout the Windows Server family. But before I get into it too far, let's jump in. We're going to talk about and give a brief introduction to PowerShell, first of all. And this will be an introduction for SQL Server administrators. PowerShell is a scripting language. It's about programming. This video is not about programming, but PowerShell is a programming tool to use for administering your server environment. So if you've already been in the script land for a while, say in the language of VB script, a lot of this will be very familiar to you, and you will instantly understand the very powerful benefits of it. If not, I highly recommend you jump in and start getting familiar with PowerShell, as Microsoft has put a lot of muscle behind this, and we're going to see a lot of stuff coming out in the future with PowerShell. But we'll get into running PowerShell 1.0 with SQL Server 2008. And for those of you who are already a little familiar with PowerShell, you might look at that and say, that looks a little fishy the way he's wording that. But I'll explain that and clarify that as I go forward, because those are actually two different things. PowerShell 1.0 versus SQL Server PowerShell. But we'll get into that. We'll get into execution policy settings. The reason I'm going there next is by default, you have some policy settings that could prohibit you from running PowerShell. So we'll look at those. Next, we'll get into the SQL Server PowerShell virtual drive called SQL Server and what that buys me. We'll look at some foundational PowerShell commands, and I'll look at two SQL Server specific commandlets, and that's using PowerShell speak. When we're talking PowerShell commands, they're actually called commandlets. So with that, let's jump into our introduction on PowerShell. And I invented my own acronym here. I call it YASL. And if you're wondering what YASL means, it says, well, yet another scripting language, right? So is PowerShell really just another scripting language I have to learn? Gee, I learned VB script. I liked it. I've got lots of scripts that I'm used to working with. There have been a few other scripting languages that we've seen creep up in the Microsoft camp. And if you've been working in other environments such as Unix, you're also familiar with Corn Shell, Bourne Shell, and all other kinds of shell scripts, right? So why another scripting language? Well, first of all, Microsoft said so. As of July 1st, 2008, it said PowerShell will be part of all server products that ship from fiscal 2009 forward. And that was part of Microsoft's common engineering criteria statement. So that's one good reason, which means Microsoft is going to throw their support behind PowerShell, and support for VB script will decrease going forward. So you're going to find yourself with fewer and fewer options for VB script. So what's some of the history? Windows PowerShell released officially to the public November 2006. Windows 2008 includes it with the base operating system. Windows PowerShell 2.0 is already abuzz, so you're going to find lots of talk and lots of features around PowerShell 2.0 already. It's built upon the .NET framework, so PowerShell allows me to take advantage of my .NET components and .NET objects. It's one of the things you're going to see emerging as a strength for PowerShell over some of its predecessors. And then another thing I really like about PowerShell, especially as somebody who's worked in Corn Shell, Bourne Shell, C Shell, former Unix guy, a lot of commands that I'm very familiar with and I just type without even thinking about them, such as cd for change directory. Well, there's a lot of people out there like me, and they were smart enough or had the foresight to alias a lot of common commands into the PowerShell environment right out of the box. So right away, you can go ahead and cd your way around the directory structure. You can ls or dir to see what's in the file system. So those common features have been rolled into PowerShell. So what goes into running PowerShell 1.0 with SQL Server 2008? And that's really a bit of a misnomer in title, in that PowerShell 1.0 is a Windows thing. SQL Server PowerShell is actually something separate. Yes and no. But let's move on. If you install SQL Server 2008 onto your Windows Server 2008 box, you get PowerShell for free, right? So if you install SQL Server 08 onto Windows Server 08, and you get PowerShell rolled in. It's automatically installed. Now, some of the documentation you come across is going to refer to an SQL Server specific version of PowerShell. That doesn't quite seem to be completely true. But what you're running to instead is a snap-in that's on top of the Windows PowerShell. So if you uninstall Windows PowerShell, you've actually uninstalled SQL Server PowerShell as well. So again, both versions of PowerShell will be on any Windows 08 machine that has SQL Server 2008 installed. Now you can also manually download Windows PowerShell 1.0 from the Microsoft Download Center. You just Google Microsoft Download Center. You can find that if you don't already have that, or if you're running on something other than Windows 08 with SQL 08. Now, when we start differentiating, however, between Windows PowerShell and SQL PowerShell, one helpful utility rises to the top, and that's simply the SQL PS utility, which is what you're going to use to run the Windows PowerShell session that includes your SQL Server snap-in. That's important. SQL Server has its own specific commandlets that are specific to SQL Server. You will only have access to those commandlets if you are running PowerShell with the SQL Server snap-ins. You don't have to think about that. There's at least two easy ways to make sure you have it. Here's one of them. Simply run SQL PS from the command line, and you've got the SQL Server PowerShell. The other thing is SQL Server Management Studio. It supports starting PowerShell sessions from the Object Explorer tree. So simply right-click on your Object Explorer within Management Studio, and you can start PowerShell from there as well. And then one other thing that's kind of interesting about the two variations or versions of PowerShell you have available, and that is in Windows Server 2008, Windows PowerShell 1.0 is disabled by default out of the box. So you can't run anything in the Windows PowerShell 1.0. However, the SQL Server PowerShell is not disabled right out of the box. So if you start up SQL PS versus Windows PowerShell, you actually can begin to execute scripts right away. But here, let's kind of put some face on some of that. Let's jump over to the server. So I'm on my SQL Server box, and this is basically with nothing else done. This is actually a clean install of SQL Server. Haven't configured anything, and I've installed a copy of my Veronica's database. So if I go to Start, All Programs, there's my Windows PowerShell 1.0, and I can go ahead and bring that up, and it says it pretty clearly there, Windows PowerShell, right? But if I go here, SQL PS brings up slightly different looking interface. We'll position these so you can see them both. There we go. With a different title in that interface. So the Windows PowerShell clearly says Windows PowerShell. And with the snap-in, I get a slightly different message. It says Microsoft SQL PowerShell and a different version number, right? So the interfaces alone look slightly different. One other place I said you can start it. If I bring up Management Studio, go ahead and log in using a local account. Actually, it's an add domain account. And I can right-click anywhere in the Object Explorer tree. And there's a choice to start PowerShell. Clicking there brings up another PowerShell window, but a SQL PS PowerShell window. The one difference, notice the path here. PS SQL Server : /SQL, yada yada yada. There's more stuff here. I'm in a different folder basically. We'll get into that in a little more detail going forward, but both of these are SQL Server PowerShell versus Windows PowerShell. All right? So let's talk about execution policy setting. There are basically four settings. There's restricted, default, all signed, and remote signed. But I'm going to go through those one at a time. Let's start with simply restricted. With restricted, you can't do much of anything. Script execution is prohibited. You cannot execute scripts. Within the Windows PowerShell, this is the default setting, which is kind of nice. Scripting is a great tool for nice people, but everybody isn't nice. So you don't want to necessarily open a door for running Renegade scripts by default. So the default setting is no scripts. If you want to run PowerShell scripts within the Windows OS, you have to enable it first, and you have to have administrator rights to do that. SQL Server PowerShell, that's not the case. We'll get to that one. The second one on my list here, though, is default. Default typically corresponds to restricted, so it's one and the same. If you were to set your policy setting to default and then go back and query it, you would see it actually says restricted. All signed says digital signatures are required for any script to run, period, across the board. That's one way to make your scripting a little more secure, by requiring all scripts to have a digital signature. That way you can authenticate who the script is actually from. But then the last one on the list here, which is actually the default for SQL PowerShell, is remote signed. This runs any local script without a digital signature. So scripts that I've created myself and I'm running them and I have rights to various things on my environment, I can just run those whenever I want to, no questions asked. Now, the moment I want to try and run a script from a remote source, however, now it will say, wait a second, I need a digital signature that proves you have rights to actually run in this environment. This is your default for SQL Server. So the two are going to be different. The first one applies to Windows. The last one applies to SQL PowerShell. And then one more, unrestricted, will execute anything, no questions asked. So changing my execution policy setting, there is a get execution policy commandlet and a set execution policy commandlet. As the name would indicate, the first one will let you know what the current setting is. The second one allows you to change it. So here, let's jump over to our server and see what we have to work with. So I'm back over on my server and I've got more windows open than I really need. So I'll just get rid of my second SQL Server PowerShell window. And we'll just look at the Windows PowerShell window to start with. Typing get execution policy with a hyphen in between the verb noun statement. Press enter, comes back restricted, versus in the SQL environment comes back remote signed. So we're good to go, consistent with what we were talking about before. If I want to change either of them, it's simply set execution policy, give it a new type such as remote signed. Use my up arrow to pull back previous commands, and I can see I have changed that. And I also mentioned how your default is the same as restricted. So saying set execution policy to default, retrieve it back, it comes back restricted. So they're one and the same. Well, since our focus is going to be SQL Server PowerShell, I'm going to get rid of this Windows PowerShell interface and leave us with the one of interest, okay? So we'll leave that there. And let's jump back over to our slides and continue on. The next topic I want to jump into is the virtual drive known as SQL Server. It's the SQL Server PowerShell virtual drive that's created for you, and it includes 4 initial folders. There's the SQL folder, which has objects related to logins, tables, functions, any jobs you have running under SQL Server, any queues you've set up, and any mail agents. There's SQL Policy, which has all of my policy-based management objects, such as my policies, my facets, or anything related to managing my policy-based management objects. There's SQL Registration, which holds my registered server objects, such as server groups, as well as other registered servers. Now, in my environment, we only have one registered server right now, and that's my default server. But then the 4th folder is the Data Collection folder, which has my data collector objects such as collection sets and configuration store. So anything related to any of the object collector objects that are available under SQL Server. Now, one little backup here. PowerShell is focused on administration more so than it is on data manipulation. So the objects you're going to see listed here will tend to lean heavily toward things related to administration of SQL Server objects, not necessarily focused on administration of SQL Server data. But here, let's look at our hierarchy actually on our server. So back on my server, I still have my same window open. And as I said before, I can use regular old familiar commands such as dir to get a feel for what's available in my environment. That's not a native PowerShell command, but it is a default alias that is set up for you. So I can see those 4 main directories and I can move into them using standard cd commands. So cd SQL moves me to the SQL folder, dir again, and it comes back with the machine name that my SQL Server instance is running under. This is the box I'm on. It's Win08-SQL08. I can then move into that as a folder also. And by the way, the shortcuts you're familiar with from your Windows CMD command windows, those all work here. So I can tab to scroll through the list of folders available. I can use my up and down arrows to scroll through previous commands. So I'll be doing that some as we move through this. But when hit a tab and it gives me the rest of that command. I can move into that. I can see default, move into default, dir again, and eventually I get down to some stuff that looks more database specific, including a databases folder. So let's go there. And now I'm looking at my actual user databases. I only have one on this instance of SQL Server, and that's my Veronica's, but I can continue this walking my way down the hierarchy of objects. So I can walk into this database, the tables, columns of those tables. Anything that's part of the object hierarchy can be viewed and in many cases manipulated via PowerShell. So let's look at some foundational PowerShell commands, general purpose commands that'll help you get started in any PowerShell environment. You know, how do I find the help key is usually one of the first things you want to know, and that's what this is all about. First of all, before I even get to the get help, the very first one on the list is my get-command. This is a PowerShell command that will list all the other commands or commandlets. Running this command in the SQL PowerShell window versus the Windows PowerShell window will give you different lists. That's because they are different interfaces and that SQL Server snap-in is in place, giving you SQL Server specific commands. The second one on the list, though, that's your help command, giving it the name of one of the commandlet names that I found perhaps in the prior command. Gives me information about that command. If I want more verbose information or a more verbose list, I can use the option -detailed to get more information about a command. And then a specific command you might be interested in is the get help SQL Server command, and I'm simply piping it to a more. We'll get into the pipe in a bit. But that gives me detailed information about the SQL Server PowerShell provider that I'm working with. Now, that's going to be too much information to fit on your screen. It's going to scroll off your screen, but your standard pipe that you've probably worked with before if you've worked with shell scripts still works. So I can pipe that to a more so that it only gives me one page full and then waits for me to tell it what to do next. But let's jump over to the server and plug those in. Back over on my server, the first thing I'm going to do is get out of this subfolder. So simply cd /. I love it. Basic shell DOS commands. I'm combining all of them in my head and it's taking all of them. But I'm going to go with a get command and let that scroll by faster than you can ever dare to read it. But there's a list of what's available to play with and some descriptions for those commands. Now, there's a dictionary or a Bible of PowerShell available in a lot of different places, including Microsoft Books Online. So I'm not going to bore you with a detailed analysis of the myriad of commands there. I'll leave that for you, but my goal is to get you started with the interface and give you a feel for what you can do with this. But this gives me a list of some of the commands. So let's actually do that again, or something slightly different. SQL Server, pipe it to more, and this will give me, as I said before, information specific to my SQL Server PowerShell provider. I talked about there were 4 folders under the virtual drive, there's those 4 folders listed toward the top: SQL Server, SQL, SQL Policy, and SQL Registration, as well as a lot more detailed information about those. You can dig into that and get more information about those. But at a high level, we've talked about what each one of those has, and actually that same information is available in this file. I'm going to quit out of this, and let's do one other thing. We'll rerun that command, just kind of give you a feel for how user-friendly this is if you're a scripter. Notice I have the redirect symbol, and I'm going to go c:\help.txt. Hit enter. I've actually just created a help file that contains the results of running this script. So those types of things are still readily available to me. So I'll mosey on over there, my C drive, and there's my help file. Double click that, and now I can play around with this, pull bits and pieces from it for use in other places, but I can redirect the output of one command into a file, pipe it to another command. All those types of common scripting activities are here and ready to go for you. So let's look at a couple of SQL Server specific commandlets. The first one is invoke SQL command. As the name indicates, you're going to run SQL statements with this one, as well as XQuery statements if you're doing anything with XML. So both of those can be run using the invoke SQL command. The other one is invoke policy evaluation. Evaluates your management policies that you've applied to your SQL Server instances. So these are 2 commands you won't utilize in the Windows PowerShell interface. You won't need those there. These are specific to SQL. But here, let's run the invoke SQL command. So back on my server, I'm going to minimize this window and invoke SQL CMD. I'll need to give it a string from SQL statement. So select star from. Don't press enter after that. You'll be waiting for quite a while for that to return because there's quite a lot of data there. So I'm going to pipe that to a more. Press enter. And voila, I'm querying SQL from PowerShell. I know that's pretty anticlimactic, but okay, I queried one of my actual production tables, but let's say I'm in a bit of a debugging session and I'm needing to look at some of my DMVs to figure out what's going on with my environment. I can do that from here as well. So any T-SQL statement that I can run from PowerShell using the invoke SQL command. So I'm going to quit out of this, otherwise I'll be waiting for 39,000 rows to scroll by. But what I want to do now is I want to run a couple more scripts for you just to give you a feel for a little bit more of what you can do with PowerShell. So what I'm going to do here is just simply run a script that I've created, c:\course files /PowerShell stop SQL server.ps1. Now, I have a folder under my course files folder called PowerShell, and in there I have a script I've created called stop SQL server.ps1. Press enter, give it a little bit of a time to think, comes back Microsoft SQL Server service stopped. Way cool. So I can stop and hopefully, if things go well, restart my service. But let's check it out. All programs, Microsoft SQL Server, configuration tools, configuration manager, and my service is indeed dead. I'll make this a little smaller so we can hopefully utilize screen real estate a little better. And then I can restart it. Let's make a quick change here from stop to start SQL Server. Comes back, says successfully started, refresh, and voila. So I'm actually able to start and stop services. So all kinds of administrative things are available via PowerShell. But here, let's actually look at those scripts. Go computer, where we say we put them, course files, PowerShell. And there's the 2 scripts. The extensions are hidden because Windows recognized the extensions. I'll start with the stop. Right click, and we'll just pop that into WordPad. And here's a real simple PowerShell script. Notice it has a function main, so it's looking for a main routine, sort of like Java. If you've done anything with Java before, Java starts with a main, C# starts with a main, C+ starts with a main. So I simply call my main, and then inside of that, I'm calling basic commandlets. Stop-service is a PowerShell commandlet. I'm passing it as a parameter $service, right, which I could have passed in, but if it doesn't receive anything, I have here hard-coded a default value that matches my current server instance name. So pretty standard programming type stuff. And then I have an option on it where I say force it to stop no matter what. So if something else were going on in the environment, I can override that and force it to stop. And then when it's done, I simply display a message saying it was successful. So that's what goes into a basic script. Taking your various commandlets, combining them together into a file, and you've got a script that you can reuse for administering your SQL Server environment. Way cool stuff. So that actually wraps up our discussion of PowerShell. So what did we actually cover? First of all, we talked about PowerShell 1.0 and SQL Server 2008, or with SQL Server 2008. And I pointed out how Windows PowerShell 1.0 is really the parent for SQL Server. PowerShell for SQL is really just a snap-in on top of Windows PowerShell 1.0. We looked at the execution policy settings, and we talked about how for Windows, your default setting is it's off. For SQL Server PowerShell, though, in that subsystem, the default setting is it's on, provided either A, your script is signed, or B, it's being run locally by an account with the rights to run that script. We looked at the SQL Server PowerShell virtual drive, which is called SQL Server. That's the name it actually has assigned to it. And we looked at the 4 subfolders underneath that. We looked at some foundational PowerShell commands, just stuff to get you started, like how do I get help? And what are the list of the commands out there? And we looked at how you can actually redirect your output using standard scripting redirects and how you can pipe it into other commands, such as a more command. I looked at some SQL Server specific commandlets, such as invoke SQL command for running T-SQL statements, as well as your xquery statements. And then we actually wrapped up by looking at a couple of PowerShell scripts that I had that we could use for doing basic administrative things such as stopping and restarting our server instance. So with that, we've come to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.